So our third speaker is Michel Bibot, who is a physicist, philosopher, distinguished writer on quantum physics, philosophy, Buddhism, you name it, and he's director of the Husserl Archives, and he will speak to us now on Beyond Panpsychism, the Radicality of Phenomenology.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to discuss with you and to present a comparison between two things, between a metaphysical doctrine which is called panpsychism and a discipline which is called phenomenology. So you see already I distinguish carefully the types of things that I'm comparing. One is a metaphysical doctrine, the other one a discipline. Panpsychism is a doctrine that says that the psyche, namely mind, so to speak, is dispersed throughout the world, throughout the things, throughout the physical objects, instead of being restricted to certain particular entities called human beings or human bodies. And phenomenology is a discipline that aims at describing lived experience. I think that the justification for this comparison is that, as we know already, as we have heard several times, something very important is missing in the picture of the world which is given by the objective sciences. This thing that is missing has received various names, none of which is completely satisfactory. It has been called qualia, experience, consciousness, everything. But the most important thing to understand is that, science is meant to connect appearances between them by means of laws, the so-called laws of nature. But the very fact that something appears is completely out of its domain because it is presupposed by it. That's the reason why I used to say that science, objective science, has a huge blind spot in the heart of it. So, but the positive aspect of science is that the more it progresses, the more it prevents one from giving false qualification of what is missing in it. Sometimes, thinkers of the past have advocated the existence of entities such as entelechis, élan vital, that means a sort of force of the life, or a sort of ghost-like soul, or a sort of spirit, a wind, which is beyond, the palpable material elements. But each one of these kind of entities have been, so to speak, replaced by a mechanism. For instance, the so-called vegetative soul of Aristotle has been replaced by metabolism. The élan vital can have been replaced by, for instance, the DNA working or interplay with the whole metabolism of the cell, and so on and so on. Now, in this retreat, there were two words that seemed to resist. It was mind and consciousness. But even mind and consciousness have been given new definitions that apparently exclude the famous missing element of science. For instance, in cognitive science, mind has been defined as a system of information processing for problem solving and decision making. Okay, but in this definition, you have nothing like, lived experience. Also consciousness. Consciousness sometimes has been redefined as metacognition or higher order thoughts or synthesis of representations, a function of synthesis of representation. But here again, you see that there is something missing. What is missing is what it is like to undergo these processes, these functions of metacognition and synthesis of representations. So, fortunately, there was a philosopher called Ned Block who finally tried to extract the last bit which was missing, and he called that the phenomenal consciousness as opposed to what he called the access consciousness. In access consciousness, he gathered all the functions that are ascribed objectively to consciousness. And with phenomenal consciousness, he wanted to refer to, if any reference is possible at all, to the very lived presupposition of all these functions. So since there is still something missing in the picture of objective science, then a dramatic initiative is needed in order to compensate this missing element, compensate for this missing element. What kind of dramatic initiative should we take? I think there are two of them on the market, so to speak, of ideas. The two extreme moves is number one, moving in the same progressive direction as science, namely, making progressors, making researchers, and trying to catch an additional property that could be added to the physical elements and would compensate for the missing lived experience. This progressive move, this move in the same direction of science that adds something to science, is called panpsychism, namely the attempt at distributing mind in every single physical element, including the most small, minute, and elementary particles. There is nevertheless a second possible move in order to compensate the famous blind spot of objective science. This second move is rather exactly the opposite of the first one. It consists in moving backwards towards, dwelling into this famous missing lived experience and try to unfold it and try to justify every claim of knowledge and every assertion of existence on the basis of this lived experience. This regressive backwards move towards lived experience is called phenomenology. It has been called phenomenology by Edmund Husserl, who created it at the very beginning of the 20th century. Okay, now let's come first to panpsychism. Panpsychism has one basic assumption. The basic assumption, in fact, is the same as all the rest of the philosophy of mind, namely, or virtually all the rest, in fact, it's that there is only one reality, and this reality is physical. But on the other hand, in this physical reality, at least when this physical reality is described by modern objective physics, there still is something which is missing. So we had to do something in order to compensate for this. The argument for the necessity for compensating the lack of qualia, experience and so on in the physical elements, the argument is that we have to take into account this phenomenon whose existence is more certain than the existence of anything else, namely lived experience. So a panpsychist acknowledges that the most certain thing ever is precisely lived experience. But I think panpsychism wrongly calls it a phenomenon. Experience is not a phenomenon. It's the very fact that there are and can be phenomena. It's what I call the fact of phenomenality in general. A phenomenon is an element of this experience. Second argument of panpsychists, it's the so-called no-emergent argument. If we could understand that experience, lived experience, phenomenal consciousness emerges out of the interplay of these non-experiential elements that are described by physics, then, of course, adding it on the top of this physical element would not be useful. According to Galen Strawson, for instance, It's not possible to accept that that a lived experience emerges from the interplay of physical particles, because, as he says, there must be something about X, and X alone, in virtue of which Y emerges and which is sufficient for Y. Let me give an example. Let me take the molecules of water. The molecules of water have no property of liquidity when taken in isolation. Yet they have something special which is called van der Waals interaction, in virtue of which you can understand that the property of liquidity emerges out of an interaction of many molecules of water. This is not the case for neurons or for anything that is known at the moment. There is nothing in virtue of which experience could emerge. So we have, according to the panpsychists, we have to ascribe experience as a fundamental and as an additional fundamental property to things, physical things. So, but of course, these little sparks of mentality, these little sparks of experience that have to be added to elementary particles or all kinds of physical entities, cannot be a complete psyche. They cannot be that, because obviously we understand that a complete psyche with all the reflectivity, all the memory and so on, is a property of a complex being. It was called by Leibniz little perceptions. Little perceptions are instantaneous moments of perceptions, and they are opposed by Leibniz to apperception, apperception being the global thing, okay, the global, mentality and experience. Some authors, such as Patloutas, have tried to figure out what it is like to be an elementary particle, namely, what is this little spark of psyche, this little spark of elementary experience that is ascribed to elementary particles. What could it be? What is it like to be an elementary particle? Of course, you cannot enter into the elementary particle to figure out what it is, even less than you can be a bat. But at least you can observe the behavior of this particle, and it's exactly what Patloutas tried to do. So he derived from this observation of what he called behavior, that's what we can call motion, or law-like behavior. He derived from that this putative, hypothetical experience was devoid of structure, devoid of complex intelligence, devoid of reflectivity, that it is fleeting, temporary, transient, and repetitive. Yet, he says, it is a little bit sentient. So this is what makes it psychical. Also, Whitehead named this kind of residual experience an actual occasion, and he defined it as a fusion of subject and object in the unified event of an experience. Now, you know that a very well-known difficulty of panpsychism is the so-called combination problem. How is it that these little sparks of experience and mentality combine with one another in order to give rise to a complex kind of mentality, the complex kind of mentality we are experiencing here and now, because we are human beings. Okay, now another problem I see in panpsychism, it's not only the combination problem, which would just in some way agree with its basic undertaking, but would just mention a technical problem in it. But I think another problem of panpsychism is even more serious. It's an in-principle problem. Indeed, the basis of the panpsychist metaphysics is first-person experience, as you have seen, because Galen Strawson insists that what is certain is our experience. On the other hand, its stance its basic stance, the stance that it adopts and which is common to every possible kind of physicalisms, is a stance of objectification, of a spectator, as if you were no longer an actor of this play of experience. So it's a little bit strange. You combine the primarity of experience with a stance which is typical of people who just distantiate themselves from experience. So I think this is a deep heterogeneity which is internal to the attitude and which makes it difficult to sustain. This was called, this was called an objective idealism by Charles Hawthorne. And this name, objective idealism, immediately shows you that there is a sort of heterogeneity in it, a tension, an inner tension to this idea of panpsychism. Also, panpsychism has been criticized by a great physicist, Erwin Schrödinger, co-creator of quantum mechanics, as a sort of game of painting, because according to Schrödinger, you can figure out the picture of the world given by physics as a purely structural, dry, empty, non-colored world. And in order to get back to the colored work, the complete colored work, you have to add color on it. But this color here is psychism. It's experience, it's qualia, whatever thing you want. So let's read Schrödinger. If one tries to put subjective qualities in or on, as a child puts color on his uncolored painting copies, it will not fit. For anything that is made to enter this world model willy-nilly takes the form of scientific assertion of facts, and as such it becomes wrong. Why? Because, this idea of panpsychism, according to which you must add some additional fundamental properties, which are psychical properties, looks like you are adding something like an objective property. But in fact, you are not adding an objective property. You are adding a subjective property, a lived property. So this idea that elements such as particles and so on have a psychical feature in it, even though very primitive, cannot be put to test, obviously, because any test would be an objectification of the property. So there is a problem. So in order to overcome this problem, I think maybe we must be much more radical than panpsychism. And we must maybe adopt the attitude of phenomenology. The attitude of phenomenology is that we should not just accommodate the glaring fact of lived experience. Instead, we should stick to it throughout. We should not leave our lived experience before we have completely established the credential of any belief that go beyond this lived experience. So this is the idea of coming back to the things themselves, where Husserl thought that what he called, in fact, things themselves were just lived experience. So Husserl asks us, I quote him, start from a knowledge that is not logically deduced, a knowledge which is immediate, clear, and doubtless, the immanence of lived experience. So his move is very similar and inspired from the one of Descartes, who just said, I can doubt of everything around me, but what I cannot doubt of is the fact of the doubt. It's the art of doubting. I can doubt of computers, microphones, and so on, but I cannot doubt that there is doubt. I don't even say I am doubting, because this is also a problem, but there is doubting. So there is doubting, that means there is experience of doubting. Now, be careful. phenomenology could be mixed up with another assumption or another doctrine about the nature of being. For instance, you could figure out that phenomenology is asserting the existence of experience or the existence of lived psyche, something like that. It would be an idealism. But in fact, no. Phenomenology doesn't claim to be an idealism as a metaphysical doctrine. It just claims to be a new way of being, namely a new way of dwelling into this experience, which is usually escaped in favor of its contents, in favor of its objects. Moreover, phenomenology has among its main critical moves a deep analysis of the birth of physical knowledge. You know, physical knowledge, according to phenomenology, is not something which is just an act of picking what is given to me by the external world. Physical knowledge is a systematic work of organizing the conditions for acting and perceiving a world. There is no attempt of searching the nature of an allegedly independent world. Therefore, it must be said that the physical world is no longer the standard of ontology. The physical world is no longer the place in which you find real beings. Even the claim that there are real beings out there is suspended. For instance, I can give an example of this move, which is much earlier actually than phenomenology. It's Kant's demonstration that the structure of Newtonian mechanics is not just arbitrary. It's not just a sort of abstract picture of the world out there. He showed that it can be understood, that Newtonian mechanics can be understood as an expression of the preconditions for elaborating objective knowledge of spatio-temporal objects. This was done not only in the Critique of Pure Reason, but also in another further book of Kant called The First Metaphysical Principle of Natural Knowledge. Now, this means that with phenomenology, we have to overturn the slogan of panpsychism. According to panpsychism, there is more to nature than what the physics of observable objective properties can tell us. This more is the protopsychism or the experience, whatever you want as a name. But according to phenomenology, the more which has been postulated and projected by panpsychism, in fact comes before, not after objectification and theorizing. It comes before because it's already there. It's present. It's here. It's our experience. I will change the word. Previous to what appears, there is appearance. Previous to present items, there is presence. This could be the slogan of phenomenology. Okay, so you remember now that in order to access to the most elementary unfabricated experience, the one which with panpsychism supposes it is possessed by the elementary particles, panpsychism tries to study from outside the behavior of these elementary particles or of these very simple beings. For instance, you could try to study the behavior of bacteria. But according to phenomenology, no knowledge is to be acquired from just external observation, especially not a knowledge of our own lived experience. So, in order to arrive at the most primitive layer of experience, we don't have to observe the behavior of elementary beings. We have to dig into ourselves. This is what I call the archaeology of mind, or the archaeology of consciousness. You have to perform the stripping layer after layer of overfabrication of the mind in order to find the most elementary, the most universally present component of our consciousness. This idea of an archaeology of the mind was first developed, I think, by Freud in his Gradiva. For him, the point was to dig into consciousness to arrive at the level of the unconscious. Here, the idea is to dig into consciousness to arrive to the pristine form of consciousness, which is called pure experience. Also, Ferenczi in Thalassa called a very primitive element of experience, he called that the oceanic feeling. Now, phenomenology uses a very precise method to do that, to defabricate the mental superstructures and arrive to experience itself. It uses a procedure called the epoche. The epoche is a Greek word, and this Greek word means suspension of judgment. It was used by the skeptics, such as Sextus Empiricus and Pyrrho, in order to say that we have to suspend the verbal judgment we have about the world in order to reach ataraxia, rest, peace. Okay? But the phenomenological epoche is even more radical than this one, because it doesn't only suspend verbal judgments, it also suspends the pre-verbal perceptive judgments, because we spontaneously prejudge that this is an object. This is an object which has its own existence. But according to phenomenology, even that has to be suspended. Even that belief has to be suspended in order to display, in order to show to oneself the procedures by which we arrive finally at this belief. Okay. So now, when we have reached this state of epoche, when we have suspended the beliefs about the existence of external things, what do we get? Where do we arrive? In fact, it's quite difficult. Husserl said that when we do that, when we do the epoche, when we suspend judgment, when we do what in Sanskrit you would call nirodha, we are initially in a situation which is akin to that of a person who was born blind, who has just undergone surgery, and who must now literally learn to see. When you arrive in this field of given experience, you are in a new realm. And I think the people who practice meditation for the first time have also this impression of discovering a land that they ignored almost. This land that they ignored, Husserl called very beautifully, he calls that the land of the mothers of knowledge, where he means that it's the place in which all the procedures by which we elaborate the knowledge are present. Also, he calls that transcendental consciousness, namely not the object of consciousness, but the acts of aiming at objects, and the acts of perceiving, the acts of emotion, all these things. Heidegger calls that being, upstream of beings, which is quite difficult in English, but it's much easier in German, because you oppose sein, which is the verb to be, and Seiende, which is beings or entities. Okay. Now, when you dig into this deepest layer of experience that you have obtained after stripping the layers of fabrication, first the layer of science, second the layer of spontaneous perception, then the layer of spontaneous beliefs, and so on and so on. Then what do you get exactly? Can we characterize a little bit better what we get? Michel Henry, a French philosopher, took as an example the experiences of pleasure and pain, which are without an object usually. You can be pleased about something, but you can also just experience pleasure. You can have a headache, but you can have a general pain, something which is not clear, which is a little bit general in you. So it's just a feeling, a feel, without a content, without an object, without intentionality. It's what Michel Henry calls the self-affection of the flesh. The immanent impression that the flesh is making on itself. So it's an embodied experience, but when we say embodied experience, we don't mean that we are combining an object called the body and a sensation. It's just the way the body senses itself before it takes itself as an object. This self-sensation of the body is the condition of possibility of any so-called outer sensation. And then Michel Henry calls, what do you call an original experience? And he answers, original can only mean this, what comes in itself before any intentionality and independently of it, before the space of a gaze, before the outside oneself. So something which is much more primitive than the projection of attention towards objects. Okay, now when we analyze a little bit more this flesh, this strange self-sensation of the flesh, we discover very interesting things. For instance, we discover that this flesh has the ability of a complete reversibility. It is jointly perceived. I can perceive something of my flesh as if it were an object, but it's also self-perceiving. Okay, we are not also. That means that we are not point-like spectators of what is manifest. We are a field of experiences which merges with what is manifest. For instance, look. Try to observe the place from which vision emerges. You will see, okay, all this surrounding, then you will see something of what you call your body. Here it is. Then you try to look at what is around here, and then in the midst you have a big hole, which is vision itself. So vision comes from the visible. Vision emerges from the visible, from a phenomenological standpoint. This is not an objective standpoint at all. It's just a purely descriptive feature of lived experience as everybody can observe. So, therefore, you should not insist that ontology is something that belongs to objects, as any physicists would say, probably, but you have to go to the very root of any ontological claim, which is the self-affection of the flesh. And therefore, instead of an ontology, a standard ontology of things, distributed around, you will have what Merleau-Ponty and Henry called an endo-ontology, namely not a projection of being onto objects, but a way of inhabiting being, of being, so to speak, of being in the midst of being. Okay? And then, if you accept this new way of doing ontology, which is not only an alternative ontology, but which is a completely different attitude about ontology, then you arrive at splendid formulations such as the one of Merleau-Ponty I quote here. Vision is the tool which allows me to contemplate from within the fission of being. So it's not that there is here a being that sees other beings. It's that being as a whole self-splits into a subject and an object. So, okay, but does this flesh only belongs to me? According to Merleau-Ponty, this is not the case. If you just suspend really, thoroughly, completely any judgment about the separation of the world in little entities, then you suspend also the division between yourself and the world. And therefore, what remains is that the world as a whole is a flesh, since it is self-experiencing now as splitting between subject and object. Where should we locate the boundary between the body and the world, since the world is flesh, says Merleau-Ponty. The world as a whole is flesh because it is self-experienced as flesh. Okay? That's perfect. Just as flesh is self-perceiving, the world qua flesh is self-objectifying at this very moment in our present experience. We are the place in which the world is self-splitting and self-objectifying. Now, let me compare the two sides. Let me compare panpsychism on the one side and what I now can call world-flesh phenomenology on the other side. World-flesh phenomenology is, in fact, a name for the last philosophy of Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Maurice Merleau-Ponty wrote a book which is quite well known, which is called The Phenomenology of Perception, but he also wrote another book which is less well known, which is called The Visible and the Invisible, and it is in this latter book that he developed his idea of the world-flesh phenomenology. So, clearly there are many features in common between panpsychism and world-flesh phenomenology. For instance, Merleau-Ponty says that quite clearly. He says that in existentialism, namely in the existentialist version of phenomenology, writes the critic, one has turned off the mind. It's just the opposite, says Merleau-Ponty. In fact, the mind has been put everywhere because we are not mind and body. We are embodied mind being in the world. Okay? So this sounds a little bit like panpsychism. And I've read recently a book by Scribina, an author who has written a history of panpsychism, and he claims he found nothing like panpsychism in phenomenology. But here you can clearly see that there is something very similar between phenomenology and panpsychism. So now that we have seen the similarity, we must also see the differences. So, as this sentence shows, the similarities are the following. There is no difference of nature between mental and mindless, sentient and inert beings in both panpsychism and world-flesh phenomenology. In both of them, experience suffuses what there is. But there are big differences also that I've documented and that I will now summarize. The first difference is that panpsychism takes the ordered cosmos of reason and science for granted. It's the physicalist component of panpsychism. Whereas, according to phenomenology, you have to bracket any belief in an external world or in the objects of science. Moreover, according to panpsychism, you have to add to the cosmos of science what looks missing in it, what looks absent in it, which is elementary experience, or qualia, or whatever. But according to phenomenology, you have to add nothing to this cosmos of science because it has itself been bracketed and suspended, any belief has been suspended. Instead, you have to go back to the source of the belief into an external world, which is an elaborate embodied experience of self-sensitivity. And finally, I would say world-flesh phenomenology takes that the world is experience. There is no difference between world and experience. Experience is another name of the world. And here I think of a beautiful quotation of Wittgenstein. In his notes for pure experience and sense data, notes for about experience and sense data, Wittgenstein says, he gives the word to an opponent, and the opponent says to him, but it seems that you have forgotten something very important in your apparently behaviorist doctrine. And Wittgenstein replies to this opponent, you mean that I have forgotten consciousness, namely life, namely the world? That's the idea of Wittgenstein. Consciousness, life, world. There is no difference. And for a world-flash phenomenologist, there is no difference either. Thank you.